Today on the HerdCon podcast, we're going to be talking to Caitlyn Pace. Not only is she a student here at Marshall University, but she's also a published author already in her undergrad. Hi, Caitlyn.
Hi.
So have you always wanted to be an author? Because it's very impressive to be an undergraduate and already a published author.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I have always wanted to be an author. It's been my dream for as long as I can remember. I learned how to read when I was 6 years old, and ever since then, I've always felt so inspired by almost everything that I've read. I've just always wanted to work towards that. I wrote my first novel when I was in middle school, and it was awful. But it was about 70,000 words. So that was my writing achievement when I was that young. Yeah. And I kind of got a high off of writing that novel because every 1,000 words felt like a major accomplishment to me. Yeah. And I just continued doing that. And I noticed that I was happier and my mental health was better when I was writing consistently. So once I noticed that trend, I tried to keep up a daily routine of writing.
That is very impressive.
Thank you.
I also really, really love writing. And I'm like, oh my God, I got 25,000 words. And then for some reason, I just cannot continue past that. My brain just hits that block and I'm like, I'll come back to it. So basically,
Definitely.
I have a lot of part of novels all on my computer. Speaking of, hitting those blocks, can you tell us a little bit about your writing process or what you do when you're trying to break away from those blocks when you encounter them?
Yeah, definitely. So I am massively inspired by Stephen King as a horror writer. And he has a book called On Writing, and half of that book is his autobiography, and the other half is his skills for writing. And he recommends that you write 2 hours every day. And I really tried to do that, but as I've read that in high school, so as a high school student going into college, that wasn't very manageable for me. So it took about a good year and a half before I really discovered a writing routine that works for me. And that is trying to achieve at least an hour worth of what I call writing stuff every day. So that includes writing, editing, researching, publishing, marketing, anything within that field. And as long as I make up an hour of doing one or more of those things, then I count that towards my schedule. And I keep track of what I do every day, which is a little bit obsessive, but it really helps me to stay on track with my goals. And I set yearly resolutions and then monthly goals for how many hours I want to meet each month. And then my yearly resolutions consist of what I would like to publish during that year, which sometimes is not always in my hands. Sometimes it's in the publisher's hands, so that doesn't always happen. So I do try to, even though I keep a strict schedule, I do try to keep a lot of openness. So if one day I am more emotionally or mentally drained and I can't write that day, then I might research agents in my field and write them down so that I can have them in the future. Or I might connect with people on social media who review horror so that I can just have those connections with me. And then it doesn't seem like a lot in that moment, but it does really build up and it creates a process that I've been really proud to achieve these last few years.
That is great because I found when I was getting my master's degree here, I took a class that basically we got to work on whatever writing we wanted to. And that was Joel Peckham. He told us that was one of the hardest parts of becoming a writer was getting into that routine and making sure that, you do stick to it. You're not giving up. So you mentioned your publisher, and that's Henlo Publishing over in Ashland, Kentucky, right?
Yes.
So when you were getting published, how did you go about finding them or contacting them? Was it through, you said you look at agents, was it through that research that you found them?
So I do look at agents, but I actually, ironically enough, met the Henlo Press at HerdCon last year.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they had a table, and my collection that I published, which is my first book that I've published, Mumblings, is a collection of horror stories based off of West Virginia folklore and other stories from the region. And when I started putting this collection together, I really wanted to find a local publisher to publish it, even though I knew most likely my options for marketing would be limited because a lot of independent publishers can't get your books in places like Books A Million, Walmart, and everything. But since my stories were so close to the region, I wanted to find a publisher that would respect that. And I was lucky enough to find the Henlo Press, which is a female based and run company. Whose mission is to support Appalachian artists who have been traditionally underserved in the publishing community and publish their works. And I've been so grateful to have them for my first publishing experience. Yeah. And I recommend them to anybody who's going about their first publishing experience, especially in this region.
So is it just for this region that Henlo is for?
Yeah, so it's for Appalachia.
Just Appalachia.
Yeah,
okay.
just Appalachia, but they try to market everywhere.
Absolutely.
Based on their funds. But they really try to target Kentucky, Ohio, and West Virginia because those are the communities that have been traditionally underserved in the publishing industry.
Absolutely. And I definitely think that it makes the fact that those short stories are from folklore of West Virginia and then it's kind of supported through that it kind of plays really well together. But you said that you had met other agents through this?
Yeah, so I actually haven't met any agents in person through this. But I do research a lot of agents and I really try to get to know the field. But I have met a lot of reviewers, interviewers, people like that in the horror genre. And that has mostly been going to conventions that Henlo goes to and meeting those people.
Absolutely.
So as a published author, you told us that just last year was when you met your publisher. Can you tell us a little bit about like what that publishing process looked like from meeting them to getting your book out there?
Yeah. So by the time that I had met them, I had pretty much given up on finding a local publisher to publish my stories, which I found personally that it's very hard to find publishers in this region, even though they do exist. Oftentimes they don't have accessible websites or social media platforms to contact you. So I had pretty much given up and was about to split up these stories and send them off to magazines instead. But then I decided to wake up one morning and go to HurtCon, and I met them there. And so by this point, my collection was already edited and put together. So I just read through it once more and added some more edits. And then I emailed it to them with my query letter and everything. And it took them about 3 months to read through it, and they accepted it, which is very nice. And then we had a couple meetings and we talked about what our vision was for this. And something unique to Henlo that's not commonly found in publishing is that the author has a last say in every process of the publishing.
Okay.
Yeah, so I was allowed to see all of the cover designs, all the edits, all the formatting, everything, and I was allowed to approve all of it before it was completed and sent out. So we went through editing and formatting for about 2 months, and while we were doing that, they launched a Kickstarter to help fund the book. And then through the Kickstarter, they also created a lot of advertising things for it, such as some Mothman pins and like your cryptid travel journal, just like some fun stuff like that
absolutely.
to hand out to people. And then once we got the Kickstarter funded and we got the book edited, we went through proofs and then we edited some more and then we published it. So it's about a seven month process, which is a lot shorter than a lot of publishers take. But I think the reason why Henlo was able to complete it within 7 months is because at this point, they were still a relatively new company, so they didn't have a lot of clients, so they could focus solely on my work for those 7 months.
And I'm sure that was just a great experience getting that one-on-one specialized, especially as a newer published author, because I imagine that the bigger publishing houses, it's easier to lose people and they don't really get that kind of attention that books deserve.
Yes, it was so truly special and magical for my first publishing experience. And that's why I tell everyone that I'm so grateful that this was my first publishing experience, because I've heard so many horror stories of authors starting out and they get lost in the company, like you said, and their book just never sees the surface of it being finished. So I was really glad to go through this. And then while I was going through this process, I started getting more and more short stories accepted by different magazines, and these were stories outside of my collection. So I really got to grow my career within these 7 months, and I'm still growing it, which has just been so amazing to see because with each acceptance, I feel like my dream that I had in middle school of
Yeah.
getting my book published, it's just coming true with each step that I take, which is so special.
That's always exciting. And especially, I think that one of the best things about it is that personalization. The fact
Yeah.
that you're there for the cover art, the fact that you're there every process, and it's very personal. Because I feel like, I mean, even in anything, when you're creating art, there is a certain amount of control that you'll have over it. And then when you're trying to get it out in front of millions of people or, get it published, often enough, you'll have other people put in what they think your art should be about, or they try to implement what their vision is on it. But for Henlo, it seems like they're very personal, and they really they took your considerations through that process and tried to make it so that you would be happy with the final product as well. And I mean, like, that is amazing because I feel like artists never really get to finish what they want to put out there. A lot of times it gets tarnished or it gets changed a little bit, but that's really amazing, especially for a first experience. That's great.
Definitely. I feel so lucky, and that is a responsibility that Henlo expresses and feels like that they have to their creative artists and writers, because they also support local artists with the cover work and with all the advertising. So they really want to make sure that people receive the credit that is due and that their vision is portrayed, which I just think that's incredible, and I would love to see more of that in Appalachia.
Absolutely.
So I just have one more question about, your publishing before we dive into Mumblings, which I was lucky enough to get a promo copy to read about.
Definitely.
So you did say that this book is already available, and because it does focus on the local, can you tell us the local bookstores that it'll be available in if our viewers want to go and pick it up?
Yeah, definitely. So it's available in Cicada Books in Huntington, Conquest Books in Ashland, Kentucky. We're currently working on getting it into Taylor Books in Charleston, West Virginia. And then it's available on Amazon and the Henlo Press's website.
Wonderful. So as you already mentioned, this book pulls so much on West Virginia folklore. And I think that that's a part of our region that's really missing from the mainstream. People want to focus on poverty in our area, and they don't want to focus on these deep beliefs that people have in the paranormal. What drew you to, those horror, dark fiction folklore of the time or of the area?
Yeah, so I grew up in West Virginia. I moved here when I was about 8 years old, I would say, because my dad got transferred with his job. So we moved here, and both of my parents grew up in West Virginia. So we have a very long history here. And growing up, I would just hear so many stories about the folklore in this region. And then when we moved here, my mom took it on herself to really explore the state and see areas that she didn't explore when she was a kid. So I was very lucky to explore so many different haunted and historical locations. And then I just slowly got inspired by them. And then COVID happened, and I was forced to stay inside and really look towards my community and my state for inspiration, because before this I had plans of not even moving out of state, moving out the country. I was learning foreign languages, and I was planning on attending university out the country. So I was looking for inspiration outside of the country itself. But then COVID kind of changed my view on everything. And I started writing this collection during COVID and kind of put it together. And that was my project during that time.
Yeah, I think COVID threw a wrench in everybody's plans, and it's changed a lot of people's lives in ways they never expected.
Oh, definitely.
So you mentioned, your experiences traveling. I really love that your book does go all across the state. I loved getting to read about, Point Pleasant and then jumping over to Harper's Ferry. All of the places that you talk about in the book, are these all places you've actually got to go to and experience?
So most of them are places I've traveled to. Some of them I haven't yet. I would love to travel to them. But I know people who live there from different friends that I have and different family members. So throughout my life, I guess I just slowly collected stories from them, and then they just all accumulated into this collection.
So, speaking of the different stories, in your author's note at the beginning, you talk about how they're too long to be a short story, but they're too short to be a novella, and you coined the term fictionettes. Can you tell me a little bit about like how you came to that word, and why you feel that it is the best representation for your work?
Yeah. So I'm glad that you brought that up because I usually don't talk about it that much because I'll say fictionettes and people are like, "What's that?" Like, and then you have to like explain it and all that stuff because it is a term that I actually didn't make up. One of my dear friends, Bob Harrison, made that term up, and he helped me edit the collection in its early stages because he has a lot of experience with professional writing. And he told me point blank, a lot of these stories are too long to be considered short stories, but they're too short to be novellas. So he just threw out the term fictionettes, and we both decided that it would be okay if I kept it. And I gave him some credit towards the end of the book for that too. But yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up.
Yeah, definitely. So, like we've said, returning to folklore, do you believe in these paranormal experiences that are in the book, or maybe not so much the exact folklore, but this idea that there are things out there that we just don't know about yet?
I definitely believe in the paranormal. I don't necessarily think it's as vivid as it's usually depicted in stories and movies. I think it's mostly an energy because I feel like this might get really hippie.
Go ahead.
I feel like a lot of life is made up of energies, and when a traumatic event happens or a really great event happens, those energies get left behind. And my mom and mostly my mom, but the rest of my family, we love to go ghost hunting for fun. It's not professional or anything. We have like some little tools, and it's just all for fun. And we make sure that we get permission wherever we go. And if it's a tour, we pay for it. It's all fun and games. But during these events, the most intense things that I've experienced are emotions. And that might just be because I'm in tune with my own emotions, or if that's actually how it exists. But I think it's just the energy traveling in that moment to the people who want to experience it.
So I know that we're both paranormal fans. So would you say that you believe in more of like this residual energy that's left in a place?
Yeah.
Because I noticed your story about the carriage trail in Charleston. There's a character in there that we're not sure if the main character, has made up. But I could also feel that being that residual energy when I was reading the story. If you want to speak to that, is that, I apologize. I'm trying to word what I'm trying to ask here.
Yeah,
Take inspiration from it maybe, or?
The story that you came up with, is that a real theory about who one of these women are that the memorial is to? Because from the story, I assumed that it was a ghost of one of the women for the memorial, but I was wanting your opinion on that.
No, so you were right about that. It was so I'm from Charleston, West Virginia, and one of my favorite places in all of Charleston is the Carriage Trail. I love to hike there. It's so beautiful. And it's especially beautiful, in my opinion, during the fall when it just looks so gothic, and they have, they don't have tombstones, but it looks like tombstones around, and just so many sculptures. And I just felt really inspired after I went on a walk there in November, and that's when I started to write The Case of Emily Peter, which is about the Carriage Trail. But when I was walking there, and then I did a little bit of research on it, when they were building the Carriage Trail, they found 2 bodies, and they identified the bodies as 2 women who most likely were killed during the Civil War.
Okay.
Yeah. So I was kind of inspired by this story because we know who these women are, but their families have kept their identity secret.
Very interesting.
Yeah. So the public doesn't know, only the families know. But I just kind of felt inspired by these women, and I started writing that story. And that was actually the first story that I wrote that was added to this collection.
I actually think that was one of my favorite stories.
Oh, I'm glad.
While I was reading it. And in that story specifically, you mention a creature called the Silencer. I grew up an hour outside of Charleston, and I have never heard of this. Is this a folklore from the area? Because I had never heard of the Silencer, or is this from you?
It's just from me.
Okay.
I made it up. That's purely from my own mindset after listening to too many creepypasta stories.
Yeah, it was. I found myself being like, "Oh goodness," very.
Yeah.
While I was reading it, I was picturing like a Slender Man-esque. So it's interesting that you
Exactly,
mentioned
yeah.
creepypasta.
Yeah, I was very much inspired by like Slender Man stories. So I kind of did that, and also body horror really freaks me out.
Yeah.
That's the one that gets to me the most. And I wanted to add a scene in this where there's a body horror aspect to it, and that was the creature.
Yeah, I noticed in not that story specifically, but some of your other stories, you do get into describing the body in ways that I think could be body horror. And I was actually going to ask you your opinions on it, but thank you for going ahead and doing that.
Yeah.
As it is a series of short stories, I noticed that some of them had a theme. I think it was maybe the first or second story in your collection. It was two girls at the Keith Albee Theater, and both of them went by names that weren't their own. And I found that to be such an interesting theme to be in there. Can you talk about the power of names or going by a name that isn't yours?
Yeah. So I know, and this isn't just unique to Appalachia. I know it's found in so many different cultures, but I know a lot of people will change their names to make themselves more presentable to mainstream society. And in the case of that particular story, it's the one at the Keith Albee Theater,
Yes.
right? Yeah. So in the case of that particular story, one girl goes by her grandma's name, and the other girl goes by a name to make her seem like a Hollywood actress because she wants to go to Hollywood. So with those two distinctions, I wanted to show the connection that you often see in Appalachia between staying in your homeland and being connected to your family versus wanting to get out and find a different community that will support you maybe, but where you feel like you belong more so than here. So that's kind of what I try to explore with those names.
Absolutely. And I think that a lot of young West Virginians, maybe Appalachians as a whole, but definitely West Virginians, feel what you're talking about, and that resonates in them. This is my home and where I want to stay, but also it's not the place for me. So I think that's really powerful, especially when we'll get into talking about the last story in your book. But when I first read the names thing, it made me think of, I know you like paranormal, I'm not sure how you feel about demon possessions, but the idea of knowing something's name gives you power over it. So I didn't know if you had thought about that connection to the paranormal and folklore any when you were writing this.
Yeah, so I love the horror genre, and I've seen so many movies, read so many books, and all that stuff. And I didn't intentionally go into the mindset with the names having power, but I'm sure I was unconsciously inspired by that because I watch so many movies, like you said, about demon possession. So I'm sure that filtered into my mindset somehow when I was writing the stories.
And then one other theme that I found that spanned stories was the idea of fire and the damage that fire can do and like the energy that a fire leaves behind. Was that purposeful, or was that just West Virginia folklore has a lot of this fire imagery?
Yeah. So I think I unconsciously connect fire with hell.
Okay.
And I'm really into symbolism. That's my favorite thing to explore in the literary and cinematic world. And so, yeah, I love to like make those connections where I can with that.
And then I know we've talked about it a little bit before we started the interview. You have a story about cave exploring, and that's what originally made me think of this question, because I just recently went on a YouTube kick of cave exploring tragedies because they're terrifying. I'm claustrophobic. I don't do caves.
Yeah.
And I was wondering how much of these stories are maybe not biographical isn't the right word, but based on those real life experiences.
Yeah. So I have two stories in particular that are based off of real life experiences. Unfortunately, they're not the cave ones because I also am terrified of caves and enclosed spaces. I have never been inside of a cave, which is ironic because I do explore a lot of abandoned buildings and those often have enclosed spaces. But I sometimes feel safer in those than I would in a cave.
You're above ground.
Um,
It's
Yeah.
a little bit of lenience.
Can you
Yeah,
speak a little
exactly.
bit to the two stories in the book that are biographical?
Yeah, so the two stories are Papa Doc and then the one in the penitentiary. The name of it is on the tip of my tongue, but we changed the name of it last minute. So I don't remember the title of it at this moment, but if you do go to the table of contents, if you're looking through the book, I do say what each story is inspired by. And it will say the West Virginia Penitentiary, so it will be that one. But Papa Doc is inspired by my great-grandfather, who was the town doctor in Thurmond, West Virginia, which is now a ghost town. It's owned by the National Park, but it used to be a thriving town. Well, I say thriving. It was a small town. It was a coal town. But there used to be a larger community there. And he was the town doctor, and he mostly helped out drunk coal miners who fell on the train tracks. If you've ever been in the town, there's a train track that runs through the town. So often these coal miners would get drunk, they would fall on the train tracks, injure themselves, and he would have to help them. But he also performed abortions during a time where abortions were very illegal and they didn't have the right medical tools for this. And my mom would tell me stories about him because he's my great-grandfather on my mom's side. And he would keep the fetuses of these that he aborted of these fetuses in jars, and he would hide them. And then my mom would come across them when she would visit him and ask him stories about it. And this is a bit of a trigger warning, but she eventually learned that these abortions were performed on young girls, like below the age of 14. So they got into this really big conversation when my mom was a teenager about whether or not that was right because he was saving another child.
Yeah.
By I guess in his words, taking out another child.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just felt really inspired by that story, especially in this political climate.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I decided to tell a Papa Doc. And then the other story that's inspired by true events, which this isn't as serious, it's just based off of my first ghost hunting experience at the West Virginia State Penitentiary that I had with my mom, my sibling, and then our friends and their mom. And it was a super creepy experience, which I won't tell you that much about so I don't spoil the story.
Sorry.
No, you're good. But yeah, we we downloaded a free app online, and we didn't think it would work because it was a free ghost hunting app. It was just purely for fun, and it ended up working. And we contacted some spirits through that, and it was one of those. It wasn't an intense spiritual experience, but it was very uncanny.
Yeah.
And sometimes I feel like uncanny experiences are creepier than intense experiences.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I can agree with that. They just leave you feeling unsettled rather than just going the quick hit of a big experience.
Yeah, definitely.
I've definitely been at the end of the day, there have been times where my air conditioner have kicked on and I think it's somebody tapping on my window or something as I'm going to lay down. And that little noise is scarier than being in an abandoned house or being, seeing something.
Oh, I cannot tell you how many times I live in a dorm room.
Yeah.
And the walls are very thin. The floor is very thin. I cannot tell you how many times on the weekends that I'll be watching a scary movie and I'll turn it off and somebody will drop something upstairs or we'll be walking, you can hear it and it freaks me out.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. While we're talking about, hearing things through walls, your book is called Mumblings, and which has made me think of the walls and hearing people through them. How did you come up with that name?
Yeah. So I really struggled to find a title for this collection. And I researched so many different titles. What should you name a collection of short stories? Because I've always heard that with a novel, you should keep it to 2 words maximum to catch somebody's eye. So I kind of played off of that rule, and then I started to look into like different collections I've read, why they named it the way that they did. And I went through this whole process just to name it the title of one of my favorite stories in the collection, which is Mumblings. And the reason why that story is one of my favorites is not because I don't think it's necessarily that creepy,
Okay.
but it talks about a toxic relationship and finding your independence as a female in that relationship. And when I'd read that story, I was reading so much Margaret Atwood, was really delving into like feminist horror, trying to like figure out what I wanted to do. So that story just always stuck with me in that phase of my life. And then I just thought it would be a catchy title, and it was one word. So it fit all the criteria that I wanted to meet.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting because, with these being folklore, it's also like the mumblings of the town people, of the people around.
Yeah.
Like the stories they whisper to each other and their kids at night.
Yeah, speaking of that, I feel like also that a lot of stories from Appalachia, and I'm in an Appalachian literature class right now, and I'll talk about this every once in a while in the class, where these stories feel like they're sometimes buried under the mountains themselves, and you have to dig to uncover them. And they're just kind of like whispering to you or mumbling to you. Like they're there, but you have to reach out and get them. So I guess that kind of leads into that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we talked about descriptions a little bit earlier, but one of the descriptions that really stuck out to me as someone who wants to be a writer was actually in the cave story when she's talking about how her dreams normally are. And she says that they are high fantasy movies with a low budget for special effects. When you're writing, how do you build these like inventive descriptions and these original descriptions that aren't cliche?
Yeah, so everyone has a different writing process, and how they experience writing is so different. When I write, so first of all, I read a lot. That's another tool that I got from Stephen King. When I read his book, he was like, you have to read a lot if you want to write a lot. So often my whatever I write at a given time is inspired by the same writing style of what I'm reading. So if something is in a more complicated writing style, I find that I often will tend to write in a more complicated writing style. I don't exactly copy it, but I do feel that I'm inspired by it. So it is very likely that I read a book during that time where the description was like that, and I kind of got it from that. But when I'm writing, I actually see the images play out like movies. And it's not super clear to me. Like sometimes the faces will be blurry or what they're doing. Like the scene won't be fully uncovered, but I can get the gist of what they're doing. So I feel like that's the line that kind of best fits what I see when I write. And also it's how I dream too. I do have dreams that feel like they have low budget special effects. So I just kind of like leaned into my reality, I guess, when I wrote that line.
I think it's really interesting that you talk about like when you're writing, you see in your head like a movie. I don't know if it's just a writer thing, but I'm the same way.
Yeah.
Sometimes when I'm trying to clear a block, I will go and look up celebrities of about the age because I'm trying so hard to get that inspiration of, well, what would this character look like? What would the look on their face be like?
Definitely.
And for me, I found it's easiest to look at someone who I think would inspire the character to describe what the look on their face in these moments.
Yeah. I when I'm writing, because I get really obsessed with little details and the symbolism behind them. If a character moves, I will often move in the same way to see how the muscles interact and see if there's a way that I could describe that that's a little bit more unique than the average way. So if I write like she waved, I'll like wave my hand and see how that actually feels and really pay attention to that movement.
That is a great tip for those kinds of descriptions.
Yeah, thank you.
We've talked a lot about, being an Appalachian and being a West Virginian and what that really means. And one of the things I really loved about your collection was the diversity in it. You talk about a lesbian couple. You have the feminist mom of Jenny who's like, my kids are going to do whatever. Yeah. And she even becomes kind of a mom to the main character in a way. Do you make it a point to represent that diversity of Appalachia? Because it's so commonly overlooked.
Oh, definitely. And I'm a huge believer that And this is something that I really developed during the pandemic when I was forced to stay in this region and I had to look towards it. I'm a huge believer that if we want to make changes in this region, we have to be the ones who do it.
Absolutely.
And that starts with showing acceptance and kindness in any way that you can. So I try to include that in my story because, like you said, especially in horror, Appalachia is seen as like to delve into stereotypes like the backwoods, inbred, stuff like that. And I'm like, that's most like the vast majority of people you encounter are not going to be like that. Yeah. They might be a little bit more conservative, or they might not have the same views that you have. But I feel like there's a space for everybody here.
Absolutely.
And in order to make a space for those people, you have to show them that there is a space. And maybe that's because I did grow up in Charleston, West Virginia. So I did get to see a lot more people who had different views versus maybe if I had grown up in a small town and everyone kind of shared the same views, I probably would have had a different mindset. But I do think that Appalachia is diverse and that there's so many regions that people do overlook because of that.
I think it's interesting that you talk about, Appalachia, especially West Virginia, being the backwoods. I think of immediately the movie Wrong Turn.
Yeah.
But I didn't know if you have seen the most recent remake of that movie. It kind of spins that on its head where these aren't inbred people. This is a group of people who wanted to live in a racially tolerant time. And so they go to the mountains to build this racially tolerant community.
Yeah.
And I found that to be a very interesting take. And so I felt like maybe an Appalachian had written that twist.
Yeah, that's something that I love that's emerging in horror right now, because traditionally horror has delved into stereotypes, but also has delved out of stereotypes depending on what you look at. But right now, because we're living in a more, I wouldn't necessarily say accepting, but a more open time, like people are more willing to have these discussions. We're seeing so many movies that are taking these stereotypes and turning them on their head. And I love seeing that, especially when it's done right.
Yes.
It's just always so well done. Like I watched not the newest Scream movie, but Scream 5, I think. And they had a shower scene with a male instead of a female.
Yeah.
And I love those little like differences that they're doing. Like they're kind of balancing the level field. So I always appreciate when people turn stereotypes on their head.
That is extremely... I also enjoy that because it's not only is it refreshing, but I feel like it's more true to life. And if art is imitating life, then we should have those moments.
Yeah, and I feel like every story is inspired by another story. I don't think anything is absolutely original. But I feel like the way that you create new works is by turning these traditional stories and twisting them to fit your perspectives.
Absolutely. So on that note of, these stereotypes and things that people might bring with them when they're reading your book, is there any information that you think would help a reader, especially if maybe they're not familiar with Appalachian folklore, that you would like them to know before reading?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I do explore the concept of traditions within this work and remaining true to your communities and your homeland and what that means, especially when you want to get out of your community. So I think if you grew up in a place where it was, because I feel like Appalachia is in many communities, you're very dependent on one another to survive. And in some places you can grow up with so much independence and you don't really need to depend on other people. So I feel like if you grow up with that independence, it would be hard to relate to these characters. So maybe keep that in mind. Also, I am a new writer, and I'm very proud of this collection, but I know I have so much growth to do. So I guess also keep that in mind with writing when you read it.
On speaking to that, I thought that it was, in a good way, very easy to read. Like I was just flying through it.
That's so good that you said that, because like I said, I love small details. I love symbolism. I also love Victorian literature, so I love that flowery language. So sometimes I can write in a way that not everyone understands. So that is something that I'm working on. So I'm glad that you found it accessible.
Very much so. And we've talked already a little bit about the last story, even if people don't realize we've talked about it. But in your book, you write in so many different styles, is the word I'm going to use. If we return to talking about the case of Emily, it switches back and forth between journal entries and case studies. And your last book is told in numbered sections, which I found was very interesting because it's the only book or the only story told that way. Can you talk a little bit about how you decided to number those or why they're numbered?
Yeah, so I actually numbered them because that's the longest story. I think it ended up being around 50 pages long. So I kind of found the segments to be like chapters, and the most of my stories, I try to think of them in a short story format, which is that it's one scene with a clear beginning, a clear middle, and a clear end that can all accumulate within like a short, maybe between like 3 to 20 pages long. But this one was longer, and I felt like it needed to be longer to describe the slow burn pace that it can feel like to live in Appalachia as a teenager, which the main character is a teenager, and she's living in Appalachia in the 60s, which is this new time of growth, and she lives in a traditional community with her family. So she's constantly battling this idea. And when I was a teenager growing up in Appalachia, like I said before, I wanted to get out. I wanted to go travel. I wanted to learn about different cultures and people. Not that I couldn't learn about that here, but I really wanted to be immersed in different regions. And so I just constantly felt stuck. I felt like I couldn't get out. And then it took COVID for me to realize that I was never stuck. I was just containing myself within my own mindset, and I had to break through that. But I wanted to explore that in that collection, and I wanted to write it longer because I wanted to have that slow burn feel.
Yeah, and it absolutely does. I was shocked when I got to the end. I was like, I never saw this coming. That was not what I expected.
Yeah.
But not in a bad way. I enjoy not being able to guess where a story's going from the beginning.
Definitely. So the ending for that, I really battled with that, and I won't say what the ending is so I don't spoil it. But I did battle with that, and I ultimately decided that I wanted to write a story about the Mothman. But I wanted to do it in a way that not really anybody had done before. And that is to say, a lot of stories about the Mothman, it features the Mothman as the main character or one of the main characters, kind of like this beast attacking people. Whereas I have come to learn that the Mothman is a symbol of, it's a bad omen. If you see it, supposedly, then something bad is going to happen. Like they supposedly saw it before the bridge disaster and all that stuff. So I wanted to take that and have it very personalized. And actually, I wrote that story during the pandemic as well. And it was about a month that I stayed in my house. I was very lucky to stay in my house during that month because I had parents who could go out, get me groceries and all that stuff.
That's always good.
Yeah, but I was going a little bit stir crazy. And I looked out my window one night, and it was like kind of dark out. But I do live in Charleston, so there are city lights, so you can kind of see what's going on. And I looked out my window, and there's this giant bird, and it was so huge. And it just looked like this giant black shadow on the trees.
Yeah.
I was like, what if a character saw this and thought it was the Mothman? And so I kind of took that and started writing that story.
Interesting. I think it's interesting that you mentioned Mothman as an omen. I know that I've read many theories that, I don't know if you know much about the Chernobyl disaster, but they said that they saw a big black bird in the days leading up to that. There was also another bridge disaster, I think in St. Louis, where they claimed the same thing, and that these have all been attributed to different versions of Mothman. And I think that's so interesting.
Yeah.
The way that is universal. I mean, this is an international belief in this creature that, I mean, I've heard the arguments that he caused the incident or that he's an omen. I agree with you. I think it's more of an omen or a warning that something's coming. But I think it speaks to how universal Appalachian folklore can be at the heart of it.
Oh, definitely. And yeah, building off of that, I also think that a lot of this folklore and creatures like the Mothman and stuff originate in that negative energy that I was talking about earlier. where if something bad is about to happen, I feel like if you believe in fate or the universe or whatever, there's going to be negative consequences that will either show you beforehand or afterhand what it is and can feel very supernatural. If that makes sense. That
Yeah.
might be too hippie too.
No, you're,
no,
you're
no.
okay. That checks. So when we were talking about how the sections are numbered, you mentioned chapters. Are there any stories in this collection that you would want to return to and maybe make its own standalone novel?
Yeah, so I thought about making the last one a novel, but I decided not to. I decided that I made this collection, and I'm happy with it, and I'm going to move on from it. But that is to say that I am constantly inspired by the stories from this region, and I actually just finished a big collection of West Virginia folklore. It's just this book on all the folklore from the region. And while I was reading it, I wrote down like 10 different ideas that I had for novels from
Absolutely.
these folklore. So I think you can definitely make novels out of these stories, and I plan to do that in the future.
Well, so I actually kind of wanted to talk about this a little bit. Before
Yeah.
we got into the little interview, we were talking about how diverse horror as a genre can be, and earlier we were talking a little bit about body horror and that kind of stuff. Where do you like to lean when you want to write something to really unsettle somebody? Where do you like to put, or I guess where do you like to hang out in your head? Like,
Yeah,
what
yeah.
kind of horror is your
Yeah, so my favorite subgenre of the horror genre is gothic literature.
Okay.
I love haunted houses. I love all of that. But I usually don't write in that, and that's
Yeah.
just because I first I come up with the idea of the story, and then I use these horror elements to help tell the story rather than using these elements
to
as
be
the story
horror?
itself.
Absolutely.
You know, yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm constantly inspired by things like the Haunting of Hill House TV show, like where they use those elements to tell the story itself, stuff
know,
like that.
Specifically, that I actually one of those scenes from that show is that the one where it's the crooked man or something like
Yeah,
that?
the bent neck woman.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
and yeah, when without like talking about that, when that gets revealed or when you get information on that and that scene happens, the amount of chills I got from it was that the imagery of it wasn't scary. It wasn't scary that it was there. It was scary that you got your answer.
Exactly. Yeah.
You're wondering, what is that thing? What is that thing popping up? Why am I seeing this thing? And then it's like the answer was the scariest part. It's not it itself. It is the content behind it. It's why it's there.
Yeah. And personally, I love and feel very satisfied by full circle stories where you get a scene in the beginning, maybe the middle, and you're like, why is this there? That doesn't make that much sense. And then by the end, you're like,
It all makes sense.
it all makes sense. It's so, I think that always is so good. I try to do that, especially with the last story.
Yeah.
Because you're kind of like, because she doesn't just see the Mothman, she sees what are known as goatmen or sheep squatches, which are also found in this region. And you're like, why is she seeing this? Why is she seeing this?
Yeah.
And then it ends, and you're like, that's why she saw it. So that's what I kind of try to do, and I love delving into that because I just think stories like that are so satisfying and just so cool to read
Absolutely.
and watch.
All right. I think we're winding down. Do you have any more questions or anything else you want to
I'll
mention
always-
before we wind down?
No, I always remember what kind of questions I want to ask right afterwards. As soon as we cut, I'll be like, oh yeah, one more thing. But no, I mean, I really wish I had more to offer to it. I mean, because horror is just such an interesting subject. And there's, like we were talking about, there's all kinds of different horrors. There's all kinds of different subgenres. And I think that like putting them into, like you said, it's not an anthology. It is a, what did we say earlier?
The fictionettes. Or,
Fictionettes.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, fictionettes. Your fictionettes. I think that that's a really great way for people to sit down and really. I think horror is so inaccessible right now, especially. I feel like we're pumping out things to just kind of fill a void of, we need to have a slasher, we need to have something that's ghost scary or paranormal activity, but like having a lot of small short stories, I think that that's a little more digestible, a little more original, and a little more entertaining than just having the same thing kind of thrown up on the screen or, I don't know.
Horror's become a for-profit
Yeah.
thing. When it used to be on the edges, it used to be, in grindhouses. You had to specifically
Definitely.
look it out. And now I feel like what you're saying is that it's lost this originality that your stories really do bring. That there were so many of them that I did not see the endings coming.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah. I hope that I didn't just like push an ending that didn't make sense for the stories, because I did try to do the full circle. But hey, you grew as a writer and you learned from what you write. But no, I completely agree with you guys. And I also find it so fascinating that during, and this has been historically proven and scientifically proven, that during tumultuous times, in particular political times, where it's just a really bad situation, horror rises in popularity, and people use it as a way to escape. Which I just always find it fascinating, because personally I do use it as a way to escape, but not so much because, well, it's distracting, but also it's a way to control the situations that you're going through. And I try to explore that a little bit within my stories, because I use it personally as an escape, but also because I feel like in Appalachia, a lot of people are trying to escape mentally from poverty or whatever they might be going through.
Absolutely.
So I try to kind of provide that platform.
Absolutely. And my favorite are zombie movies. I research them. I love it. I mean, slashers and ghosts as well, but zombies have always had a special place for me. And I was really expecting to see a rise in zombies after COVID.
Yeah.
This idea of a pandemic. And I just don't think that that's been seen yet. I don't think we've finished feeling the artistic reverberations of going through a pandemic.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. I always find it fascinating that during the AIDS epidemic, vampire stories rose in popularity and little stuff like that.
Yeah, it's like people are, like you said, trying to control their reality.
Yeah.
They're trying
definitely.
to maybe work through their problems on their own by using fiction.
Yeah, and I think that's a way of dealing with, if you want to use the word trauma, I think that's a way that you can healthily process your trauma based on how intensely you go about searching these stories.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I had the pleasure of teaching English 101 here for a couple semesters, and my first unit was always narrative, because I always told the students that taking your story into your own hands gives you a different kind of power.
Yeah,
No matter what else is said,
definitely.
you have told your story in this format that no one else can take away from you.
Yeah, I completely agree with that.
All right. And before we close it off, I just have a couple more questions. If someone does read your book, what do you hope they take away from the book?
I hope that whatever they take away is personal to them, depending on where they're from. If they're from Appalachia, I hope that they find connections with these characters, whether that be through your ties to your community or through escapism, because I try to explore both options. If you're not from Appalachia, I hope that you learn more about this region, and that it does have diverse stories that deserve to be explored and told.
Okay. And then what advice would you give to someone who wants to write a story or wants to get published, those authors out there?
So I think the thing that limits not only writers, but just artists and creatives in general is imposter syndrome, because we live in a capitalistic society, and that's not traditionally funded. It's not something that a lot of people feel like they are good enough or deserve to chase after. I just want people to know, especially young writers, that no matter what you want to write or create, there is an audience for it. Even if it's just one person or it's a million people, there is at least one person who's going to like what you create, and you should make art and you should write for yourself, but you should also know that there's going to be people who support you, and hopefully that helps with imposter syndrome a little bit.
That is a great message to send out there. I always try to keep in mind that a lot of our best-selling authors that we know of were in their late 30s when they really started hitting that stride that we know them for.
Yeah, well, speaking of imposter syndrome, to go back to Stephen King, who's one of my favorite authors, his first book was Carrie. He actually threw it away before he sent it out. Yeah, because he thought it was so bad. And his wife took it out of the trash can. It was like, you should send this out. It's not that bad.
Yeah.
And he got it. And now he's Stephen King.
Yeah, exactly.
So you never know what could be your Carrie or what could be your Walt Disney moment. You never know. You just need to keep creating and keep trying. but you also need to take mental health breaks because it can't be
Absolutely.
emotionally draining. So go for a walk, take care of yourself, but go and be creative.
Yeah, I definitely think it's true when we say that we are our own worst critics.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I completely agree.
Whenever I played in music and band class, I would always like bash on myself, and my band director was always like, "Bro, you're like first chair trumpet for for a specific reason. You're a good player," and that's something that I've been dealing with myself, is just telling myself that it's okay to be creative and just not to bash on myself all the time. Like, being critical is okay, but like always telling myself you're bad, you're bad, you're bad, you're bad is something that I've been dealing with myself.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
I've been trying to work on.
Yeah, that reminded me of something because a big part of my creativity is in surrounding yourself with people, creative projects, books, movies, whatever you watch. Make sure that they're inspiring you and not taking away from you. That's something that a parent would tell you, like make sure you hang out with the right crowd. But it's true. You gotta be mindful of what you're doing. And if something's draining you, you need to try to get that off your life if you can.
Make sure you're hanging out with the right books.
Yeah, the right books, exactly.
And just for our viewers or listeners, the person that you just heard was Nate, our AV guy. All right.
Hello.
Right. Thank you so much, Caitlyn. I just want to remind our listeners that Caitlyn's book, Mumblings, is out, and you have a new book hopefully on the way soon, correct? You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I am working on so many projects. You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok by my name, Caitlyn Pace, and I spell Caitlyn Caitlyn, and then Pace, Pace. Should be able to find me and keep updated on all my projects. I should have another book coming out in October, and that is a choose your own adventure slasher book. So be on the lookout for that. And I also have a bunch of short stories published in magazines and other podcasts. So you can look out for the links to those on my social medias as well.
And we will link your social media under the descriptions of both the podcast and the YouTube video that we release.
Oh, okay, great.
So people can easily find you and follow you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for being here. Oh, go ahead, Nate. Sorry.
Want to remind our listeners where you can buy the book?
Yes, that's what I was getting ready to do right as we close. Thank you, Nate. Good. If you want to remind us just one more time where they can pick that book up.
Yeah, so currently you can buy the book at Cicada Books in Huntington, West Virginia, Conquest Books in Ashland, Kentucky, or on Amazon and the Henlo Press's website. And we're working on getting the book in Taylor Books right now, but it's not there yet.
All right. Thank you so much, Caitlyn. It was great talking to you.
Thank you guys.
Thank you
This
so
has been
much.
lovely. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.